Ben Harper woke up at 4 in the morning, as he had done every morning for the past 15 years. Before dawn, he was leaving his small trailer on the outskirts of bustling Chicago and getting into his old pickup truck. Time was running out, because the company's garbage truck for which he worked left promptly at 5. The work was hard, poorly paid, and, as Ben liked to joke, left no room for romance. But it was the only job he could afford after dropping out of school to help his family. His life flowed in a vicious circle, collecting garbage, a short lunch in the backyard of the office, returning home late at night, and a modest dinner in front of an old TV that he never dared to throw out. The only outlet for Ben was his passion for cars. Since childhood, he loved everything related to cars. He could tinker in the garage for hours, splattered with oil, not noticing how time flies. His biggest dream now was to restore the old 1967 Mustang he had bought for pennies from a neighbor. The car was in poor condition. The body was peeling and covered in rust. The engine needed a complete replacement, and the interior looked like rats had lived in the car. The Mustang didn't run, and it seemed like it never would again. But to Ben, it was more than just a pile of metal. It was a symbol of something bigger, hope that his life could change. Sometimes he imagined how one day he would finish the restoration, start the engine, and drive straight to California, to an ocean he had never seen. The dream was simple: sunny beaches, the sound of the surf, and freedom. But his dreams of California seemed further away. The medical bills of his long-dead mother and the monthly rent on the trailer were eating up most of his income. There was almost no money left for parts for the Mustang. Sometimes Ben thought about selling the car for parts and getting rid of it, but every time he approached it, he felt that parting with the car would mean giving up on his dream. One day, his boss gave him a new assignment. A garbage truck had to go to a closing racetrack in the suburbs and take away the trash from a recent event. Ben and his partner arrived at the place early in the morning. It was a huge complex with a long race track surrounded by aging grandstands. Life had once been in full swing here. Hundreds of spectators, the noise of engines, adrenaline in the air. But now the place looked abandoned. While his partner was loading containers with trash, Ben decided to walk along the track for a while. He reached the starting line, where a massive, perfectly maintained race car stood in the morning sun. It was a real monster on wheels, with a bright red body, shiny parts, and the number 23 on the door. Ben stopped, fascinated by it. He imagined himself sitting behind the wheel, hearing the roar of the engine, feeling the vibration of the steering wheel in his hands. But this fantasy was short-lived. He knew his place in the world and knew that it was far from such cars. At that moment, a tall man in an expensive suit came out of a building next to the track. He noticed Ben standing by the car and, nodding, came closer. Ben expected to be chased away, but instead the man introduced himself as the owner of the racetrack. His name was Victor Cross. As it turned out, Victor was not only the owner, but also a collector of vintage cars. He was a talker and, seeing Ben's interest in the car, he started a conversation. Ben, at first timidly, told Victor that he worked on restoring an old Mustang in his spare time. Victor was interested. He asked what Ben did, what skills he had, and Ben got carried away and began describing his work. Replacing brakes, restoring ignition systems, welding. Victor listened attentively, and then suddenly said that he was looking for a mechanic for his garage to finish restoring one of his cars. Ben thought it was a joke, but he could tell from the look in Victor's eyes that he was serious. The offer sounded too good to be true. Working in Victor's garage meant not only a raise, but also the opportunity to do what he loved. However, Ben was hesitant. He was used to stability, even if that stability consisted of hard work on a garbage truck. A new chance scared him. Thoughts swirled in his head. What if he fails? What if this is a mistake? However, deep down, Ben knew that he could not pass up this chance. He thanked Victor for the offer and promised to think about it. He spent the whole day at the racetrack, loading a garbage truck, but thoughts about a new place did not leave him. He imagined himself working in a large, bright garage, bringing cars to perfection, which would then participate in races or end up at shows. It was like a dream, and Ben began to feel that perhaps for the first time in his life he had a chance at something better. Returning home, he did not immediately make a decision. He went out to the garage, sat down on an old chair next to the Mustang and ran his hand over the rusty hood. He remembered how many times he wanted to give up, but he continued to work on the car, believing that one day it would become beautiful and powerful. This evening was decisive. Ben realized that in life there are rarely second chances, and he must take a risk. The next day he called Victor and agreed. Ben Harper could not believe that he agreed. The new job seemed something completely impossible, almost a fairy tale. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope in his chest. But with it came doubt. Standing by his trailer early one morning, he looked at the old pickup that had seen him suffer every day and suddenly thought, what if he couldn't do it? What if the dream he was finally taking a chance on turned out to be too big for him? But he pushed those thoughts aside. All that was left was to get started. On his first day at the track, Ben arrived before dawn. Victor Cross was waiting for him at the entrance to the garage, a tall white hangar with large windows that smelled of oil and metal. Inside, everything was different from what he was used to. Instead of the old, dirty equipment and scattered tools in his own garage, everything was sparkling clean. Toolboxes hung neatly organized along the walls, and 3 cars were parked in the center. These were real works of art, rare models, each of which looked as if it had just rolled off the assembly line, despite its age. Victor showed Ben around the garage, explaining what he would be working on. The main task was to help restore one of Victor's most valuable cars, a 1965 Shelby Cobra 427. This car was a real legend, but at the moment, it looked like a miserable fragment of its former glory. The body was dented, the engine was disassembled, and the interior looked more like an old sofa than a sports seat. Victor said that he bought this car at an auction several years ago, but he never got around to bringing it to perfection. From the very beginning, Ben understood that the task would not be easy. He had to work under the guidance of the chief mechanic of the garage, a man named Troy. He was a strict and laconic man of about 40, who, as it turned out, did not believe in Ben at all. Troy scowled at him and watched his every move closely the entire time Ben worked. Ben knew he had to prove his worth, and he spared no effort. The work started off simple, disassembling the remaining body parts and diagnosing the engine. Ben dove head-on into the process. His hands, long accustomed to hard work, confidently held the tools. He acted methodically, recalling everything he had learned over the years of tinkering with the Mustang. Gradually, the excitement gave way to confidence. Each successfully completed step gave him courage. When he had disassembled and cleaned the engine cylinders, Troy finally said, "Not bad for a newbie." That was all he said, but for Ben it meant a lot. The days passed one after another. Ben practically moved into the garage. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave, delving deeper into the intricacies of the repair with each passing day. He was given increasingly complex tasks, and he coped with them, sometimes staying until night. During breaks, he looked at other cars, studying their designs, parts, approaches to restoration. Gradually, he began to realize that he was in the very center of the world he had once dreamed of. But the work was not the only challenge. In addition to the difficulties with the repair, Ben had to face himself. Doubt still haunted him. One day, while he was working on a complex fuel injection system, something went wrong. Troy, having discovered the error, responded sharply, "I told you to pay attention. This is not your barn Mustang. Precision is important here." These words struck a chord with Ben. He felt that Troy was right. Perhaps he was simply not cut out for this level. But, having gathered his strength, he decided not to back down. The turning point occurred a month into the job. Ben was tasked with rebuilding the Shelby Cobra transmission, one of the most complex parts of the car. This task became a kind of test. He was given a week to complete everything, and no one really believed that he could handle it. But Ben, having missed several nights, worked hard. He consulted books, asked Troy for advice, albeit reluctantly, and also recalled his own mistakes with the Mustang. When everything was ready, Victor himself came to see the result. Ben remembered that day for a long time. Victor looked inside the car, carefully examined everything, and then turned to Ben and said, "Great job. Just like I wanted it." These words sank into his soul. Ben felt that all this time, sleepless nights, doubts, stress, had not been in vain. With each passing day, he felt more confident. Troy began to warm up to him, trusting him with more responsible tasks. Ben realized that this was the place for him. He no longer doubted his decision to leave the garbage truck. Working in the garage gave him not only an opportunity to learn, but also a chance to become someone more than just a person who does hard work for money. However, one day, returning home after a long day, he noticed that his Mustang was spending too little time. The car was still sitting in the garage, covered in dust. It reminded him of his main dream, to finish the restoration and go to California. But now he had a new goal. He decided that he would bring the Mustang to perfection and then drive it to where his dreams would become reality. The next day, he came to the garage with a new idea. He suggested to Victor that after finishing the Shelby Cobra, they restore his Mustang too. It was a bold offer, and Ben knew that the chances of approval were slim. Ben decided to offer Victor his idea. Asking the man who gave him the job to invest in his personal dream seemed incredible, but Ben felt that passing up the opportunity would mean betraying himself. One evening, when the work on the Shelby Cobra was coming to an end, Ben plucked up his courage and walked into Victor's office, trying to look confident, although inside he was shaking. Victor looked busy, but friendly. He listened attentively, without interrupting, as Ben told him about his car. Ben described how he had worked on it for years, collecting every single part, how it had become a symbol of hope for him. When he mentioned his dream of finishing it to perfection and one day driving to California, Victor raised his eyebrows slightly, but continued listening. Finally, when Ben finished, Victor thought for a moment, then said, "Bring it to the garage, and we'll see what we can do." The words, simple and almost mundane, were like music to Ben's ears. He practically ran out of the office, feeling that life was starting to turn in his favor. The next day, he loaded his rusty, half-disassembled Mustang onto a trailer and brought it to the garage. The car looked odd among the shiny sports cars, but for Ben, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Troy, seeing the Mustang, narrowed his eyes skeptically. "This junk? Are you sure it's still capable of anything?" he muttered, looking around the car. Ben didn't answer. Instead, he opened the hood and began to show off what had been done so far. Troy, to his surprise, noticed that despite the terrible state of the body, some of the engine parts were in good condition. "Okay, let's see what happens," he said, and a hint of respect flashed in his voice. Work on the Mustang began. This was a whole new challenge. The Shelby Cobra was a team effort, but here Ben took on almost everything. Victor gave Troy a little time to help with the toughest parts, but mostly Ben worked alone. He spent nights in the garage, stripping away rusted panels, cleaning and rebuilding every bolt and screw. Sometimes he felt like he was back in his trailer alone days, only now he had better tools and support, if not the loudest. As the days went by, the Mustang began to take shape. The body, which had been covered in rust, was now gleaming with fresh paint. The engine, which Ben had rebuilt practically from scratch, was running again, emitting a deep, satisfying growl. Ben felt inside that this car was becoming more than just a means of transportation, but a symbol of his struggle. Victor would occasionally come into the garage to watch the progress. He would look over Ben's work, nodding approvingly but saying nothing. Ben knew that this silence meant trust, and he was trying not to let it down. But at the same time, he felt the pressure. All this time he had been working on his dream, and if the car didn't live up to expectations, he would lose not only his face, but also the respect he had worked so hard to earn. The real test came when it was time to test the Mustang on the track. Ben sat behind the wheel with trepidation. A few months ago, the car wouldn't even start, and now he held the wheel in his hands and felt the engine vibrate powerfully under the hood. Victor, Troy, and the rest of the mechanics gathered at the edge of the track to watch the first run. Ben took a deep breath, turned the key, and the Mustang came to life. The sound of the engine echoed throughout the garage, and there was power, confidence, and strength in that roar. He pulled the car onto the starting line, looked at the long, empty track in front of him, and sharply pressed the gas pedal. The car took off, picking up speed. Ben felt his heart pounding and the wind hitting his face through the open window. It was a moment of triumph. Every turn, every straight gave him the feeling that he was driving not just a car, but something much bigger. This was the result of his work, his perseverance, and his belief that dreams could become reality. When the race was over, Ben returned to the garage. He got out of the car and all eyes were on him. Victor was the first to approach, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Great job, Ben. You turned a pile of metal into a masterpiece. Now this is your ticket to where you always wanted to go." Ben couldn't help but smile. This was not only his success, but also the moment that changed everything. He realized that thanks to Victor's support and his belief in himself, he was able to do the impossible. The next day, Ben loaded a few things, the necessary money, and a road map into the trunk of the Mustang. He thanked Victor for everything and, shaking his hand, said, "Now it's my turn to continue on." Victor just smiled back. Ben pulled out of the garage, heading west. Fields, mountains, and an endless sky flashed past the window. Ahead was the road, and ahead was the ocean. Ben sped down the highway, and his Mustang purred like a contented predator. It was the perfect moment. The wind blew on his face, the engine hummed, and the sun sank below the horizon, filling the road with orange-pink light. It all seemed unreal, almost like a dream. But it was his reality. He left Chicago behind, left his hard work, left everything that was holding him back. Now his path lay only forward, to California, to the ocean he had never seen, but dreamed of since childhood. After driving several hundred miles, Ben stopped at a small roadside gas station somewhere in Kansas. He filled up the tank and bought a cup of cheap coffee. The stars were already filling the sky, and the highway was almost empty. He peered at the map, wondering which route to take next, when an older man came out from behind the counter and glanced at his car. "Beautiful," he said, running his eyes over the shiny body. Ben nodded, smiling, but did not answer. The older man added, "Stay off old Route 66, man. It seems faster, but there's been a lot of trouble there lately. Heard of robberies?" Ben thanked him for the advice, but after looking at the map, he decided to take the risk. He wanted to take a shortcut, and the old man's warning sounded like local tales. Route 66 was darker than he expected. Only the Mustang's headlights pierced the dense gloom, and the occasional sign reminded him of civilization. Endless fields stretched around him, and the road seemed endless. An hour later, when Ben had already gotten used to the solitude of the highway, he noticed a flashing light ahead. As he approached, he saw an old van parked on the side of the road. A man in a hat was waving next to it, trying to stop it. Ben slowed down. He knew it could be risky, but it seemed wrong to leave the man in such a remote place. The man looked about 50, his face hidden in shadow and a wide-brimmed hat. "Thanks for stopping," he said, approaching the car. "The van broke down. There is no signal. Maybe you can give me a ride to the nearest town?" Ben hesitated, but eventually agreed. The man climbed into the passenger seat, carrying a small leather backpack. He looked haggard but not dangerous. He said little as they drove, which suited Ben, who didn't want to take his eyes off the road. The man glanced at the Mustang occasionally, but didn't comment. About 30 minutes passed when the passenger finally spoke. "Nice car," he said, examining the dashboard. "Rare to find these days. Your project?" Ben nodded briefly, explaining that he had restored it with his own hands. The man smiled slightly and, as if jokingly, added, "Are you sure it's yours?" These words caught Ben's attention. He looked at the passenger with bewilderment, but the man had already looked away and was staring out the window. A wariness crept into Ben's mind, but he decided not to pay attention to it. Perhaps the strange manner of speech was simply part of this stranger's character. The The road became more and more winding, and the lights along the highway disappeared. Only the stars and the moon illuminated the way. Suddenly, the man abruptly pointed to an exit. "It's shorter here. You can take a shortcut," he said. Ben slowed down, but something inside told him not to turn off. No, better to stick to the highway, he thought, and continued driving straight. The passenger looked at him for a long moment, but said nothing. After a few miles, it became clear that something was wrong. Headlights appeared behind them. A car was approaching quickly, overtaking them, and then abruptly stopped across the road. Ben slammed on the brakes. A black SUV was parked in front of him, and two men got out next to them. Something glittered in their hands. Ben immediately knew they were robbers. His heart was pounding. He looked at the passenger, waiting for a reaction, but he was smiling calmly, as if everything was going according to plan. One of the men approached the car, knocking loudly on the window. "Get out, buddy, and leave the keys here." Ben did not move, his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. "This car is ours now," the second said, aiming his gun straight at the windshield. And then the passenger did something Ben did not expect. He slowly opened the door, got out of the car, and motioned for the men to stop. His voice was calm but cold. "Guys, step aside. We have a deal." Ben froze. A deal? What did that mean? All sorts of guesses flashed through his head, but there was no time to think. At that moment, the passenger abruptly pulled a weapon out of his backpack. It was a short shotgun, which he aimed at the robbers. "Now it's your turn to leave the keys," he said with such calm that it became clear that this was not the first time he had encountered such situations. The robbers hesitated, and then rushed to their car and sped away, leaving the road empty. Ben could not believe his eyes. He looked at the passenger, who got back into the car as if nothing had happened. "You shouldn't trust everyone who seems harmless," he said, buckling his seatbelt. These words, said with irony, confused Ben even more. When they reached the nearest town, the passenger got out of the car, said a short, "Thank you for the ride," and disappeared into the crowd without turning around. Ben wanted to call out to him, but changed his mind. Only a couple of minutes later, he noticed that the passenger's leather backpack was still on the seat. Opening it, Ben froze. Inside was a wad of money, neatly tied with a rubber band, and a note. "For your dreams. Don't ask where it came from. Just use it wisely." Ben stared at the backpack for a long time, not knowing what to think. But one question was clearly in his head. Who was this man? The car jerked forward again, and its roar echoed across the empty road. Ben no longer looked for answers. The ocean was waiting for him.